Yeah. Normalement, ça disparaît. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, friends, we shall slowly, just slowly, don't feel I'm pushing anybody towards what is going to be an exciting start into the evening for us here at the EPC. Voilà, allez-y. Fine, absolutely good. We agreed to do it. Yeah. All right, please feel free just to come forward as suits. Thank you very much. All right, Tatiana all set. Doors are going to be closed. Recording is going to start. A very warm welcome to the European Policy Center. We're absolutely delighted to have you all with us. And I say this as someone who has benefited greatly from a generation that has actually built, in many ways, the foreign policy infrastructure and has shaped policies that build our union. And for us, this is a very exciting moment here. To welcome first and foremost His Excellency Ambassador João Vale de Almeida, former ambassador of the European Union to the United States, the United Nations, and the United Kingdom, and luckily for us, also a senior advisor to the European Policy Center. And when João reached out to us to suggest we might be wanting to host the launch of his book in Brussels, we were absolutely delighted. So thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. And this is indeed the reason why we are convening here today. You see in front of you the Divorce of Nations, which has been written and published by Ambassador Vale de Almeida. And I am very happy that we are joined by very distinguished panelists. The mise en scène couldn't be better because, and we are continue to be joined by others. Warm welcome, please come forward, take your seats wherever it suits you. By colleagues, former colleagues who have shaped in many ways the destiny of the European Union, of member states' action. And this is absolutely delightful for us. So I warmly welcome Ambassador Sir Ivan Rogers, former permanent representative of the United Kingdom to the European Union. Very good to have you with us, Ivan. And also a very warm welcome to His Excellency Pierre Vimont, former Secretary General of the European External Action Service, amongst those who build an infrastructure for the Union's foreign policy deployment, and of course also a distinguished diplomat with a career in his home country, France, currently a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe, and our wonderful colleague Elena Lazarou, a senior policy analyst and advisor the External Policies Unit at the European Parliamentary Research Service with a wealth of experience in analysis and also advising those that contribute from what I always deem, and she knows that as a very important perspective, and that is, of course, a parliamentary perspective as we grow and delivering on the foreign policy challenges between member states, the European Union's institutions, Europeans under the umbrella of the European Union, but also together with partners in Europe and elsewhere. It is very good to have you all with us here. And what we did and thought would be interesting, and excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, it is delightful to see you here because we want, of course, to make this a conversation. This is only a starting ramp for our evening because we have the privilege to discuss here first on our podium what is actually in the book and what drove the author to write it. And I personally think it's very important to look at the human beings behind what often looks for outsiders, not an audience like this, needless to say, but as something that is just happening and that is just shaped as part of some institutional magic. And of course it is not. And so this is a great opportunity to exchange over also the ambition where we would want to see our union going forward with all the challenges that that entails. So that means we would like to have you also come into the conversation. And we will have, after an exchange here on the podium with our guests, an exchange with you as well. And then you will have the opportunity also, if you would like to, not only to purchase the book and read it, but also to have the opportunity perhaps to have an engaging conversation with the author. So Ambassador Vale de Almeida agreed to also sign book copies, which is great. So this will be in the adjacent room, and you will have the opportunity also for refreshments over that, and hopefully further conversations. So without further ado, let me start into this and ask you, João, I mean, looking back at decades of not only a role in shaping foreign policy as ambassador, but also as a chief of staff of a very important commissioner with Barroso's time shaping in the presidency, the union at a point in time when the Treaty of Lisbon and everything surrounding that was sort of taking off. This was a very warm welcome as well, Excellency. The time span you're looking at in your work, in your various roles in service of the European Union, is one that is the first quarter of this century, and this in which you shaped in your various vantage points, what the Union tried to contribute to a world, and yet that was probably daunting, given all the developments that we have seen. And this is what you're looking at in the book as well. And what we would like, of course, to hear from you is the why. Why is it that you decided, well, this is something I would also want to write about after such a long career, and this is something I would want to put onto pages. So guide us a little bit into what drove your thinking, and share with us what motivated you. And I think that should be on. Yes. I think it is on and working. And if you...
Is that okay?
Yes.
Great. First of all, thank you very much for spending a late afternoon with Lisbon weather inside and not outside. That's a great honor for me. But most of all, I want to thank the EPC and Helmut and where is Raul and all the team that made this possible. Thank you very much for hosting me and all of us here today. I want to thank my mentors, Ivan and Pierre, and my dear colleague and friend, Elena, for joining us here. And good question, Ahmed. Why did I write this thing? I think, first of all, because I kind of like writing, which is a good starting point, because I just, after finishing it, imagine that one has to write a book without having pleasure in writing. That must be a real sacrifice. So I think the first reason is the pleasure that I have in writing, even if I had to write not in my mother tongue. The second one, which is more important, is that I feel that I have a duty of sharing. And I wanted to share this duty with those who have not yet fulfilled that duty. I see a number of them in this room. I realize that, people like me that work for the union for decades, I don't see that many that had the same kind of experience as I had doing the same. It's not in the tradition. Maybe I want to start a tradition. I want to invite this room that is immense knowledge, outside this room in different buildings in this city, and in different nice places in Provence and Algarve where they spend their retirement, there is a huge amount of knowledge that I think should be shared. So that's another reason. But maybe the main reason, as always, is that I promised my wife that I will try to stay busy and not complicate her life too much. She's sitting over there and she cannot deny this. That's what I tried to do by spending a few months writing the book. And maybe last but not least, and I have one of our sons here today, the other one is too far in California, and we have 3 grandchildren. I wanted to first tell them more or less what I've been doing in the last 40 years, and sometimes they wonder, what is this guy doing, going out and traveling and all that, and but also leave something for them and for our grandchildren to think in terms of what we have done and what they could do and the challenges that lie ahead. So this is basically why I went into this adventure. It's been great. well received in the UK, hope well received here, and most importantly, an occasion for us to exchange views, to discuss, and to try to find ways forward for this world and for the European Union. There you are.
When you first approached me and inquired, I was also very interested, of course, that you are doing what probably no one else has done so far. You are writing about something that for many is quite a niche subject, not for all of us here in this room, but how do you explain foreign policy of a union that, you know, has member states and sort of a lot of institutions and et cetera, et cetera. So that was kind of a pioneering job as well, both in the doing, but also now in the writing. I personally find there is also a dignity in you know, telling the story of our union, which often looks for many outsiders as a bit more technocratic. And that is what I found particularly engaging in your book, that you fill it with life, that it's human beings who are actually shaping things, not only yourself, but also your colleagues. And I think that is, nobody has really done that. Why?
I think the advantage of someone like us, most of us in the room, who are practitioners and not academics. You know, I see many people talking about Mr. Putin. They never were closer than thousands of kilometers from Mr. Putin. Some of us have been very close, sometimes even too close to Mr. Putin, to know what we are talking about, or at least, and I don't pretend to know much about Mr. Putin, but at least I have my personal impressions. I provide my personal testimony of encounters with him, as much as with all the other leaders that I refer to in the book. And I think this is what a practitioner brings to a discussion. I don't pretend to know as much as an academic about all the issues I touch upon here, but I try to bring a personal dimension, a contextualization, so that people are more familiar with the way diplomacy works and also the way leaders work. These are normal people, just that their egos are bigger than ours, that their self-confidence is bigger than ours, and their resilience is bigger than ours, physical and intellectual and mental, and they sort of like to have power, and they do everything for power. But at the end of the day, they are human beings, men and women like us, that most of the time react to the same stimulus, with the same basic instincts, and with the same, impulses. And I think that's a dimension. It doesn't explain history totally, of course, but it's a dimension that only those who have been around, only the practitioners can bring. And that's what I tried, to at least do in this first instance.
Let me turn to Pierre Vimont, because when I was reading the book, I couldn't help following João on his journey coming from inside, building the union as chef de cabinet of Commission President Barroso, but then deploying. In parallel, there was a building work that was being done, and you are one of the architects of the backbone, and that is the European External Action Service. And there's also a chapter in the book that talks about the how the union is working in this way. I know you had a look also at the book. Sort of, what are the things that captured you most, and where you felt that is exactly how me, in my role with my experience, would have wanted the union to sort of grow into? What were your most sort of relevant impressions you got when looking at João's book?
First, let me thank you for inviting me, and thank you, João, for writing this very interesting book. You were alluding to the fact that many of your colleagues haven't written books. I'm one of those. Because I always hesitate between memoir and, and balancing between memoir and essay. And I think what is fascinating in this book is that you have managed to combine both of it. And that makes a very interesting read. So I haven't been asked to do this, but I recommend reading Joao's book, which is a very interesting one. To answer your question, what I think is interesting from my point of view, reading Joao's own experience with the External Action Service, is that Joao was posted abroad, and in fact, Washington, right from the beginning of the External Action Service. So he managed to some extent to avoid the chaos in Brussels of the first year.
Others were stuck with it.
The first year. But it's interesting because I think one of the real added values of the External Action Service at the end of the day was the network, the diplomatic network, the delegation network all around the world. Many of our partners outside of the European Union have time and again recognized that this was a real plus with the External Action Service. We haven't received always the same congratulations about what we have done, but with regard to the external network that we set up, there is a sort of common recognition that this was rather useful, and you can detect that from Joao's book, either in Washington or in New York with the EU delegation. That has made a lot of difference. Having one single EU delegation with the EU ambassador. Many member states don't like this title and refuse it, but this is the reality. It's a focal point. And many of our outside players are quite happy to have this focal point abroad, or when they come to Brussels, to have the High Representative as a contact that they can reach to when they come here.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask, I mean, I was excited as a young analyst to see this happening, and I read a lot of the things. Obviously I wasn't anywhere near where you were. Was it also a learning that you had an ambassador, a first ever, deployed to this very important part of the world at this very important time of the world as well? If we remember, and this is what also the book of course talks about, there was a banking crisis that then had its lot of waves that affected very much Europe, the European Union as well. I mean, was it also a sort of a mutual learning that your antennas out there in the world started to feed back to you and say, well, this might be sort of what is written and how we conceptualize, but this is actually, we forgot, that these things might happen and occur because the crowded space of the member states, or sort of, was it a back and forth in that initial time as well?
It's a very good point you're making, because at least when I was in the External Action Service, I'm not entirely sure that it was precisely working the way member states, embassies work, with this constant reporting back and forth, which I think is important. One of the issues we had, at least at the beginning with our EU delegation, is that they were spending so much time in trying to get coordination with the other member states' embassies, that our EU heads of delegations were telling us time and again, I don't have enough time. I think Joao managed to travel around the United States, and to some extent our EU delegation in the US is a bit different. Because of the size, because of what the US is all about. But in many smaller countries, it was more difficult for heads of delegation, first of all, to find time enough to report extensively about what was going on in their home country. And secondly, I must say also for the EAS to take on board what they got from our EU delegations, because there was so much focus, as always, navel gazing at what's happening in Brussels, that they were missing some of the important things happening outside. But I'm sure this has improved since then, I have no doubt.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of sort of a more member state perspective in this and bringing it to Clive, and also giving you the opportunity to pick whatever you think is the most interesting and relevant thing you want to put to this audience in this book, but also as someone who served in many different roles and paths crossed as well, from the perspective of the United Kingdom. What are your thoughts on this sort of playing between member state and union? But of course, also feel free to have a dive into what you like most about the book or found most relevant, interesting, challenging.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me, and it's extremely good to be here, back in my old hometown, which is sadly a bit of a rarity. And thanks very much to João for writing, I think, a splendid book. I think he makes the central point, which is practitioners have an entirely different perspective from...
Just put it a little bit closer so then we can...
Practitioners have a very different perspective, for obvious reasons, from theorists or lawyers or political scientists. And part of what I've spent a lot of my professional life doing in a range of issues, not solely on European international issues, but on other domestic issues, primarily from my treasury background, is trying to close the gap between practitioners and people who are involved in intense political debate with politicians and serving politicians, and theorists who have frequently forgotten more about European integration or tax policy or fiscal policy than practitioners like me, but have never actually been in the room when you've had to decide what to put in a budget or what to do at a European Council. So I think that's an immensely valuable thing to do. I totally agree with you that more people should be encouraged to do it. As Pierre rightly says, I think avoiding the memoir, I mean, quite a lot of Foreign Office people back at home have written memoirs. I'm always slightly wary about doing so. One can, clearly tell a whole load of anecdotes about one's interactions with various politicians. I'm not sure about that, and I'm not sure.
There's quite a few in there as well, for those who are interested.
There, what it does is combine that and a light touch, and it is genuinely funny and witty and provocative, with some serious reflections on what these various experiences have told João about the art of policy making, political economy, broader politics, through a time of immense crisis, which sadly carries on. So from my perspective, of course, it's extremely interesting reading an Anglophile, indeed Americanophile perspective on what has been going on in the UK and what's been going on in the US, and reflections from our debate in the UK. And it drove me mad both when working inside the system, and it's driven me mad since, is it's solipsistic, it's self-absorbed, it doesn't reflect on how this bears on anybody else. It's conceived of as an entirely kind of internal debate amongst ourselves. This very frequently still affects to a degree, British negotiating policy, where an awful lot of the debate seems to be amongst actors rather than with any other players inside the European Union. That drove me mad, as I say, as a practitioner, to read the perspectives of a serious person who, as I say, starts with an empathy for an Anglo-Saxon view of the world and an understanding of it, which is unusual and deep, is a very interesting thing to read and reflect on, because inevitably João offers the kinds of perspectives that you don't get from British commentariat classes or British officials. And I've always found that most interesting. I'm not a diplomat, I hasten to add, as João and Pierre could testify, and they would probably testify from my behavior, that I wasn't in any sense a diplomat. What I enjoyed about masquerading as a diplomat was by and large, the perspectives from the other side of the table are much more interesting than the perspectives you get from your own authorities in London. I used to say to my staff regularly, don't tell me what London thinks about X and Y and Z. I think I know that already, and it's my job to know that, and I fully understand what's determining that. What I really want to understand are the people on the other side of the table, and what animates them and what motivates them, and where they need to get, and what the outcome of a negotiation can be. So I want the perspectives on the other side of the table. I'm not very interested in the perspectives on our side of the table, because that's second nature to me. I ought to know that. And again, I think João brings that kind of perspective to life. You can't do our kinds of jobs, the kinds of jobs that we did, without empathizing a hell of a lot with your opposite numbers and getting to know your opposite numbers, getting to know what makes them tick, but also kind of what is likely to be, what inevitably is in their instructions, what the art of the possible is if you're trying to negotiate outcomes which work for you and work for them.
And if I can nudge you, because you were saying you were kind of a masquerade diplomat, so sort of for us to understand a little bit more your perspective on how effective has the union been working with these new roles, and with this kind of where is the added value that you saw? And you said they were around the table, had suddenly sort of an entry into a conversation that would have taken a lot more time had I have to go to all those places individually. And what is it that one should understand from the other side of the channel, if you were to look with a sort of a friendly perspective on the union and the work that João and others have done and are actually doing? What is it that on the other side of the channel people should never sort of underestimate or miss out or misjudge? If you were to give a manual to those who we are engaging with now, of course, in a different constellation. The book is also about that, and you can be looking forward to this as well. But what's your sort of advice to those on the other side of the channel in engaging with the union?
My advice to those on the other side of the channel patently failed regularly over many years, if not many decades. So I think I'm probably the last person to talk about it.
That's what I'm interested.
One is dealing even now, despite the process of European integration. I don't think we're alone in that. We're obviously an outlier and an outrider in it, but you're dealing often with mutual incomprehension about other people's incentives and other people's politics. There's a very good reason to set up, the European Union or European Economic Community, which turns into the European Union. That's not really well understood by the British public or probably other publics. As you rightly said at the beginning, this is when people who are not immersed in our world look at our world, it looks dry, arid, technocratic, boring, and distant from the public. This is very much why João has done us a service in bringing this much more to life. The reason why the union was ever invented and why we constructed the kinds of institutions we have has rather been lost, and we're in danger of losing that debate more generally. The reason why we do business in the way we do, however tortuous, and it can be murderously tortuous, it can be slow, it can be deeply frustrating, it usually is deeply frustrating to be involved in, but it's far better than the alternative. And few people, sadly, in the UK, with some notable exceptions at the political level, ever really made that case for why you require the kinds of mechanisms and the kinds of institutions and the kinds of processes that we have developed. And they can look arcane, they can look bizarre, they can look overly complex, they can look absurdly bureaucratic. And at a time like this, when hard power is back on the world stage and people are making a merit of being, strong men who are cut through all the crap from institutions and from bureaucrats and technocrats, we're in a world where we're in danger of going back to a pre-First World War world or an interwar world. That's an extremely dangerous thing to do, which will ultimately be bad for. There are reasons why we've developed the kind of technocracy that we have. Now, the danger, of course, is the degree of public alienation, not just in the UK, but it is, it surfaced in the UK, not just in the Brexit process, but well before the Brexit process. But there are very good reasons why we've ended up with the kinds of institutions and the kinds of processes. And, everybody in the European Union has different nightmares. And they have their own nightmares, and you see that on the security side. And the security nightmares in Portugal and Spain are not necessarily the security nightmares of Finland and Poland. But that's one reason why you bring all together in a union. And it can only work if there is that empathy and understanding at the political level and at a visceral level of what other people's nightmares are. And we have good reason to have nightmares on this continent in our history over the last several hundred years.
Yeah, we're going to compare notes on how we see the world evolving and the unions and Europe's role in it in a minute. But I want to bring it to Elena, and as someone who has, as an academic, but also as someone who is navigating now within this institutional system of EU foreign policy. When you started reading the book, is it what you expected? Is it what you thought, as someone who has studied also for many years the theory of Europeans working together in that way, and then seeing somebody who was pioneering as a practitioner, what is it that struck you most when you looked at the book?
First of all, thank you very much for having me on this panel. I used the word humbled when I told some people I was going to do this, and I am humbled to be in this company. I also want to say that, a book is good when you find yourself. I was given this book on the 8th of May, so it was my Europe Day present. And I read it over that long weekend in various trains, planes, and other places. And a book is good when, while you're doing that, you find yourself laughing at parts, reflecting at other parts, and sending a lot of screenshots to various people and saying, look at this, look at that. And it's really commendable, the book. The other thing I want to say before I go into the answer is that there's two things that I don't know, I would call him João, Ambassador Almeida says in the book that I think are very interesting and were almost existential for me. One thing is, he says, everyone remembers where they were on important dates. Everyone remembers where they were on 9/11. And he also says there are no coincidences. And to describe that, he uses a set of years. And I was almost shocked because the years he uses are 2001, 2008, 2016, and 2022, which are the years in which I moved to England, to Brazil, to Brussels, and then out of my house in 2022. But then I could remember where I was every time something was happening. And he describes the first quarter of our century, which for me is basically my adulthood, and is a whole history of things that have happened. And it's incredible the pace at which they have happened. But going to your question, it was extremely interesting for me exactly how I was reminded of things I learned as a researcher and as academic. And at times we forget, and the practitioner opened the eyes to that. The first thing I think is in using this brilliant metaphor of the divorce to remind us that personality matters. And that is something we know in foreign policy analysis. We are taught this since the age of 19, but we tend to forget what that means. And I really encourage everyone to read the parts about the young Putin, the young Xi, the young Hu, the young Trump or younger, because in those personality traits that they exhibited when João first met them, you can see the seeds of what they became later on. And foresighters could wonder, had we better studied those personalities, had we used a different type of approach, could we have had as Europe a different type of result? It's a question mark. But it also speaks, of course, to the divorce metaphor, because you always know there's something you don't really like about your partner, but you say, okay, that's going to pass. But then 20 years later, you're like, oh, and in the end, this is the reason we separated. So that works very well. Second thing that for me was very interesting was the warning signs and the alarm bells. And there's various parts of the text where the author says, at that moment, the alarm bell struck me, but that moment, didn't happen at that moment. For example, when China starts to bend rules and there is an alarm bell about Taiwan on the South China Sea, but we don't see that manifesting its proportions. It's 20 years ago in 2002 or so. And then now, of course, this is a major issue in security and defense. But the other interesting thing is that it's not just China. On the occasion where he describes 9/11, he talks about how that time it was the United States bending the rules of multilateral behavior. And then we later on see how that basically spreads, how the first moment where you have bending of rules, you basically have the beginning of something much wider, which today we call the crisis of multilateralism. So in that sense, it's very much a lesson in foresight. The other interesting thing, and maybe that's in the last chapters, and it's an issue which unfortunately is no longer that popular, but it's the United Nations and multilateralism. And I was reminded very much of John Ruggie and his theory of why we have multilateral institutions, which is basically diffuse reciprocity. Everyone needs to feel they're getting something out of it, and it needs to be proportional. And what the ambassador talks about is essentially how states have used the multilateral system at times, for example, when China accedes to the WTO, but they have also bended it. And then this great need for reform that the United Nations has, which is exactly to fit into that purpose and making states feel that, it is serving them. Because one thing that is spread across the book is the fracture, or the sort of threat to the rules-based international system. And I think it's very important to remember, go back to the theory of why we created it. But of course, it is also a celebration of the EU. And there are many points about the EU's and its successes, and I feel that are not that much communicated and that it's pointed out there. For example, that the EU was the greater exporter of vaccines during COVID, or the EU's success in being represented in the United Nations, in getting observer status. There's a great moment about two countries, I think it's Denmark and Italy, who decide to share their, Netherlands and Italy, the United Nations Security Council, sorry.
Beautiful solution that was found.
Yes, or the first time that with the ambassador in place, when we have Antonio Guterres elected as Secretary General of the United Nations, we have a European Secretary General. I mean, the multilateral system has been a triumph for the EU, and we forget to celebrate that. And then finally, perhaps to say, and again, going to this marriage metaphor, we tend to be surprised by behaviors and actions of states, but one thing that is made very clear is that we shouldn't, because states don't change that much in the way they behave. Maybe the environment changes. And I think none other than the United States is used as an example in this book to show that we should have known and we should know how the United States will behave. Because yes, there is the Trump phenomenon, but it's made very clear that throughout the time that is described, exceptionalism and isolationism go hand in hand in a delicate balance where the United States are concerned. I think the ambassador says in the book, which is very interesting, that exceptionalism will always mitigate isolationism if we manage it the correct way. But the other thing that's interesting is even the fact that at the moment when Hillary Clinton thinks she's going to be elected, it's all about jobs and reducing exposure abroad and boots on the ground abroad. And then this becomes the Trump agenda. So essentially what we're saying is, we know the United States, we know how they operate. So it's a matter of diplomacy to use that knowledge and to manage a relationship with them that can be beneficial for the EU, which is my final remark. I was reminded once again, not that I need a reminder, of how important diplomacy is, and we have here had just now the discussion about the EAS, but the greatness of the profession, but also the value of the observation that can come from, I just want to make this a bit light, but living in the same building as Nikki Haley and learning more about her background, or being there in the rooms where things are happening, the dogs, the food, and the conversations that come along. Yes. So really, I could talk about it for hours, as you can see. I think it was great. It's light. It's easy to read. I'm going to give it to friends who are not IR specialists, but it really does go to the depths of what we know about foreign policy analysis. And somehow it soothed me in reminding me that we actually know most of the things. It's a matter of remembering and having actions that match the analysis that we have for so many years been studying in the research.
Excellent. Thank you, Elena, for also, I think, a bit more appetite amongst those who might have been thinking this is sort of, a lecture about the world and foreign policy. Yes, it is, but it is also an entertaining one in a world that doesn't look very entertaining. And I had that similar feeling. And let me bring this back to you, João. And I mean, the book is called The Divorce of Nations. And the first 25 years of this century that you witnessed and helped shape is looking like a right mess in many ways. You're talking about the divorce of nations on the one hand, but also about the divorce within nations that is happening. And we see that in Europe as well. What I would like to sort of do here amongst us is a little bit of a mapping and comparing notes, how we are seeing this world and how to find, with all that probably looks daunting, opportunity for Europeans to understand better their agency, their power, because you talk also about power in the book, which is what is not often associated with the European Union. How do you see this environment evolving? What are the lessons we should certainly be learning now that the world is probably not going to get easier for Europeans to navigate?
Thank you, the three of you, for making my book much better than it is. Let me just come back with a little story about the role of EAS. I was in Washington. I once visited the then Deputy Secretary of State, Bill Burns, who was lately the head of CIA and one of the top American diplomats and a great person and a good friend. And he was telling me, Ambassador, I'm very worried about you. And the fact is that too many of my people are going to your building in K Street Circle. And there's something wrong here, and I have to manage this. I said, well, yeah, I don't know what I can tell you, but you know, I'm not forcing any diplomat from the State Department to come to my building. So why the hell is happening? He said. Well, I think the only explanation I have is that, like all people, they are slightly lazy. And if I can offer a meeting with 27, 28 at the time, ambassadors or diplomats, they rather come to my place or ask me to organize the meeting instead of going to the 28 embassies of the 28. So, you know, and this is one of the things I try to do in the book, is to bring things that seem too complex, too complicated, too sophisticated, to down to earth, to normal behavior of people. We have lazy diplomats, the Americans have lazy diplomats. The advantage of our system is that we organize member states in the best possible way. You know, smaller countries in Europe don't have the networks that the bigger countries have in a place like Washington or anywhere in the world. See that in New York or London as well. We try to create a level playing field in terms of access of information or access to contacts by working at EU family level. Now, on your more substantial point that you made. Let me try to sort of provoke the discussion with a few points. First of all, my question, the underlying question in this book is whether or not we are moving or sleepwalking or moving towards what I would call an age of divorce. It's irreversible that the 21st century is deconstructing what the 20th century in its last part has built without providing alternative. That's what I call this century so far a rebel without a cause. So we are deconstructing, but we are not really building a new international order. So the question remains then. And I come to two paradigms which are not in the book, so maybe they come in the next book. But anyway, if you look back at past decades and what we have today, in the past, and if you look at the position of the West, my book is a Western-oriented book. It's a Euro-Atlantic, pro-Euro-Atlantic book, assuming my support to the transatlantic relationship, to NATO, and to the EU. That goes without saying. But if you think of the West up to now, and you try to oversimplify, you see that the West was united to contain Russia. Different shapes and forms in different intensity. This was the simple kind of organizing principle. Contain Russia and China, uphold our values and interests, and protect the global order that we believe was beneficial to mankind and certainly beneficial to our values and interests. This is the world we live in. This is the world I grew up in, and obviously try to contribute to. What could be the new paradigm that we be seeing evolving right now? It's one in which the United States, at least some in the United States, seem to prefer to organize the world in a different way, and privilege the role of superpowers, and instead look at the world and see US, Russia, China, at least for the time being. Let's carve out spheres of influence that respect each other's core interests. Let's organize in a sort of a strongman club culture, and in doing so, we have to make concessions here and there, but we fundamentally go back to the core essence of national sovereignty. And this is what worried me at the beginning of the year. And I wrote an article for a Portuguese paper. The headline was "The End of Decency and the Beginning of Uncertainty." Portuguese beginning is called princípio, and princípio is also the equivalent to the word principle. So the end of decency and the principle of uncertainty. And this is what I'm seeing. I was seeing in everybody, we were all watching this as Trump comes in. Where are we today? Are we being sort of confirmed in our worries about this new paradigm? Or should we be reassured at the end of the day, as Elena was saying, and I say in the book, there are underlying trends in the US that will not change. They have, waves and nuances, but at the end of the day, the US will come back to a more normal attitude. And today, 3 months or so, more now, almost 5 months after inauguration, I'm still very much worried, as much as I was in January. But somehow I'm slightly less worried. Because what I've seen from Mr. Trump is certainly the end of this fundamentally negative heritage or legacy that Mr. Trump will bring to the political world is that the standards of decency have lowered immensely. The way he behaves, the way he talks to people, the way he talks about people in next to them or in their absence. I mean, this is all the things that at least I try not to teach my son to do, and I'm sure he doesn't do. But is this the way we want our grandchildren to be educated in school? But also, Mr. Trump is giving any small dictator and big dictator around the world a blank check, green light. I mean, if this guy can behave like this and still be reelected and survive, and why shouldn't I do that? So I think Trump's legacy today, I see it more, or the more worrying side of his legacy is the lowering of standards, the destruction of the values that we thought were our international organization. I'm slightly less worried, or less, let me say, I have more doubts today than I had in January about his capacity and his willingness and even his kind of plan to replace what we had before by something totally different. If you look at it on tariffs, if you look at what is going back and forth on Ukraine, it's unpredictable, it's worrying, but it's maybe slightly less worrying than it was in January. But I just launched this one.
And let me ask Pierre Vimont in follow-up. I mean, in a way, what we're seeing is Europeans understanding that they seriously have to up their game. And my soupçon would be that from a French perspective, to bring you sort of more into that sort of mode, and ask for some in Europe, this is probably more daunting than for others, because to conceive a world that is different from the Euro-Atlantic, transatlantic shaping. I say this as somebody who was brought up in the 1990s in the sense of, a German in Western Europe, where the United States were completely indispensable, and we would have never been where we are now without them. What is it that, how do you see Europeans sort of overcoming and probably understanding that there is also an opportunity here, and it does look like some have energetically understood that we have to do something, including in a Franco-British, and I will turn this to Ivan in a minute as well, energy that we see, and really, making sure that Europeans now look after their own security to the extent they have never conceived in the past. But some of us, probably in Paris, have always had, some bigger thoughts about what that could look like. So, from your vantage point, Pierre Vimont, how does the global environment for Europe look like?
I have great difficulty in answering your question in a very straightforward way, precisely for the reason that João was underlining a few minutes ago. What we're witnessing at the moment I think in the US foreign policy and Trump's somewhat chaotic diplomacy is some sort of soft landing, progressive, still uncertain, not entirely clear, but something that looks like professionals are slowly moving back into the room. We're still very far away from that, but it's becoming maybe a little bit more easier to understand. Look at Ukraine, for instance, and it's still very complicated, but one can sense that the first impression, which was very much anti-Zelensky, anti-Ukraine, is moving maybe to a more balancing act, maybe. We hear that maybe on Gaza, Trump may be moving towards, I hope, a more realistic approach and less straightforward pro-Israeli government policy. With Iran, it is interesting what's going on, and his current visit to the Middle East seems to indicate that maybe the Gulf countries are now going to be able to play a major political and diplomatic role in the Middle East and elsewhere, and that is also interesting. By the way, in my opinion, the real threat with regard to the Trump administration has more to do with domestic politics in the United States, and the real threat, I think, to democracy and to some of our liberal democracy rules, more than foreign policy. But having said that, in my opinion, the real danger for the Europeans is precisely because at some point they were just thinking that this was a wake-up call and that we had to live with Europe without the United States, and that suddenly America was going to disappear. There would be no more US protection, security protection, so on and so forth. So there was this sudden discovery that we had to jump into into the void, and that looked really dramatic. But precisely because we're seeing signs of some kind of soft landing, immediately the realistic people inside Europe are suddenly saying, oh, maybe this is not going to be as terrible as we thought, and therefore let's not go for radical changes. Let's put it that way, very simple term. Let's not go for strategic autonomy in the French way. Let's find some kind of middle ground. We're going to be able to live with America still. Maybe at the end of the day, the whole issue is about improving our expenditure, let's go for 3%, 3.5%, 5% of our GDP dedicated to military expenditure. That will appease the US and everything will be fine. And my personal impression is that the major issue is still there on the table and many Europeans don't want to see it, which is, do we have to live with a threat that will come back every 4 years when we have US elections on whether the US is still decided to support the EU, or whether we have to stand up and accept the fact that now we have to some extent to work on our own. How are we going not only improve our defense and have a real European defense policy and a real European foreign policy also, because I think that is just as important, but also how to live up to the challenges of competitiveness, about new technologies, so on and so forth, everything that the Draghi report has said. And those are major challenges. And we all know that we don't know exactly how to deal with that in each and every one of our member states. And that's the issue. So why not go for the easy option? In other words, the US will not go away, it will stay there. It's very much of the same once again, except that we have to do a little bit more effort in terms of defense expenditure and so on. And I think that would not be the right answer. And I sense that somewhere here in this place, people are starting to think that maybe the danger is not all that hot. It's not all that of a hot issue, and that things will find their way through as they did in the past. And could I just add a point, because I was quite
Absolutely,
fascinating about what Elena was saying about anticipation, foresight, and what João also was saying. The problem I've always been facing with foreign policy and diplomats is that we have a huge load of papers anticipating what is going on. After all, we could all more or less anticipate that there was a very good chance that Trump would be re-elected. And in the year before Trump's re-election, everyone here in this city was talking about we should maybe prepare the possibility of a Trump return. We should discuss that between the 27 of us or between the 2 or 3 or 4 of us. And in fact, we didn't do much because everyone was thinking, I'll find a way out of this. I will do it on my own. And I think we're very much stuck in that kind of attitude. And I'm not blaming anybody, because it was the same thing with the COVID. It was the same thing with many of the we're not very good at anticipating in liberal democracies. We need to be facing chaos and crisis in order to live up to the challenge. Otherwise, it's not all that easy.
Yeah, bring it to Ivan in a sec, but João, please, and thank you. Yes.
As the Anglo-Saxons say, or the Americans.
30 seconds, huh?
30 seconds to figure. No, just one point. I agree almost entirely with what Pierre said. I'm slightly less on the sovereign autonomy side than he is, but because I'm very attached to what NATO represents and what we need to do on the transatlantic alliance, and I know he is as well, but it's a question of nuance. But my main point here is that I'm worried by the current debate in Europe around Trump, and the issue is we have an anti-Americanism dimension on the right and on the left, right? That's historic in Europe. I would not want us to give up on the United States too soon, because if we do so, it is to our detriment. So I think we should look at the long cycle. We should handle Trump in a proper way, and I could say a few things about that, but we won't have time. And I think we are doing a pretty good job up to now, I must say, Europe and the UK, in handling Trump. But at the same time, we should not allow this debate to move, which is often the case, too soon to jump to conclusions and say we should forget about America. We should not, we cannot afford to give up on America. That's my complete what Pierre said.
Yeah, and can we perhaps, I mean, I've been looking at what João has been describing since you finished the manuscript, and there's also, of course, talk about a certain divorce that was going on with regard to the United Kingdom and the Union. But what we see within a few months, I have to say, I'm very grateful for that, in a rather unprecedented speed and depth, with limitations perhaps, but a rapprochement on things European with London, and that personally I find encouraging in that understanding that Pierre described. I mean, how fast can Europeans adapt to this situation? I'd like to think the glass is rather half full than half empty here, because there is a very serious conversation going on, and this I see as seriously moving on from earlier this year and last year when you finished the work on this book. Ivan, what's your?
Yeah, well, I'll come back to the UK question, but just on the US and issue, I very largely agree with what Pierre says, and there's always a reflex in this town and around the European Council and elsewhere to think, well, maybe things are not too bad and something will turn up and we don't really have to act as decisively. That reflex is always there at leader, Sherpa, perm rep level, and one should never underestimate it. I'm slightly worried about that. We've got through, you're seeing it as well in markets where we've moved from euphoria at the time of Davos to total gloom and despondency in early April on Liberation Day, back to euphoria within the space of a month. This is lunatic on both sides. I think the situation is genuinely pretty grim, but as Pierre rightly says, it may be some reasons for hoping for some soft landings and some indications that the US has noticed that it's bitten off more than it can chew. Notably, let's be honest, on the Chinese reaction, miscalculating the Chinese reaction function to tariffs, threatening them if they went ahead with retaliation. The Chinese duly retaliated it's essentially, as far as I can see, that the Americans have backed off and found a way to commence the negotiations. And one has to hope that the centre of gravity of the kind of trade debate has moved more towards the Scott Bessent end of the market than the Peter Navarro end of the market. Having said that, what the US is experiencing is a challenge, as it sees it globally, from China. Why did I mention the pre-First World War period? Because this is a little bit analogous to British behavior at the end of empire, or at the beginning of the end of empire. Trump's rhetoric reminds me of no one more actually than Joseph Chamberlain, who was the father of Neville Chamberlain, but a much more interesting figure in many ways. But the father of sort of British protectionism, the founder of the Tariff Reform League, the founder of imperial preference. When the UK was, and the British Empire was increasingly under pressure from both Germany and from the US in terms of global hegemonic dominance, what did we do? Despite the fact that we constantly talk about ourselves as undying free traders throughout, this is wholly untrue about British history and wholly untrue about Conservative Party history. And the Conservative Party has had many spasms of a Brexit variety, and one of them was imperial preference and tariff reform, which actually lasted for at least 30 years, from 1903, foundation of the Tariff Reform League, to what the UK, along with the Americans at the time of Smoot-Hawley, introduced in the early 1930s. My worry about this is not, do I think they'll go through with the greater insanity of Liberation Day, April the 2nd? No. But we are in a different paradigm and a different economic regime, and we're seeing a different economic orthodoxy emerge in the US, and it's driven by domestic politics, and it's driven by right-wing populism. And you're seeing that across Europe, European Union and the UK as well, where right-wing populism is more effective and more popular than left-wing populism. So I worry, yes, there are some signs of a degree of rationality emerging in elements of the US debate under markets pressures and bond markets pressures. But let's not kid ourselves. These are not free traders. These are mercantilists. So indeed are the Chinese. And why does Europe, the European Union, as well as the UK, have a big problem? I think the UK has a bigger problem because we're a small player bobbing around in the kind of mid-Atlantic, and we deliberately left our trade bloc, which is not necessarily a terribly clever thing to do in the light of subsequent events. But why does the European Union face trouble? Because it's not a full spectrum superpower, and the other two are, and they're increasingly mercantilist, aggressive, protectionist powers. And it's come as a big shock, I would say, in the UK, as well as in the EU, that the US might be a strategically unreliable partner. I agree with João. Of course, one shouldn't give up. And of course, that's the instincts of the kind of London political class and the London Mandarin class. Nevertheless, it's a hell of a shock. What's happened with the re-emergence of Trump, it shouldn't have been a shock for the reasons that Pierre gives, but it has been a hell of a shock. This sense that the US might never return to being the reliable strategic security partner is the big shock in London. And it doesn't, it probably computes even less well in London than it does in Brussels, in various other European capitals, because all British foreign policy, at least since the Second World War, and certainly since the Suez Crisis in 1956, has been predicated on this not happening. And now it's happened. And of course, there's a degree of wish fulfillment in UK policy as there is in European policy of, well, this can't be happening. And maybe there are ways of muddling through. And maybe actually, this is more similar to dealing with George W. Bush and, Tony Blair. I don't think there are many similarities between George W. Bush and Donald Trump. So I think there is a danger that we conclude it's all manageable. We'll find a way through. Look at British behavior and look what we saw last week with the deal, which incidentally is not a deal. It's the outline or a framework of a possible deal with a few upfront, concessions or upfront moves. But in no sense is a deal. It might become a deal. It might move towards being a free trade agreement. I think the UK doesn't want to be party to American efforts to pull down the multilateral system, to build on Elena's point. The US is not wedded to the multilateral rules-based order. It wants to destroy it. And it wants essentially to say that despite the fact that it founded it through the Bretton Woods institutions and developed it, actually developed it in contradiction to the old British Empire. There's a lot of very strong American thinking during the war and after the war, which was directed against imperial preference and against the British, and saying we were going to design a new world order. And what we're living through now is the Americans having seemingly decided that they were the primary victims of the world order that they created. And that's a pretty dangerous moment. That reminds me of kind of, you know, it's the wrong analogy because of course it's not remotely comparable, but it is a bit of a stab in the back legend of a kind of, we were duped, we're the primary victims of having been duped. These institutions have turned against us. We allowed the Chinese into the WTO. This was a horrendous mistake. No, it wasn't, in my view, and I worked on it when in Brussels with my American opposite numbers, because we tried to get the Chinese into the WTO for very good reason. But there is a doctrine which is spreading in Washington of a kind of, we are the primary victims of the global order that we created. So I worry about that, because you're seeing it on climate, you're seeing it on tax, you're seeing it on, you know, it's not just WTO, you're seeing it on the IMF, you're seeing it on the World Bank of a kind of, we don't like the world, or you're certainly seeing it on the UN system and the attempts essentially to undermine an awful lot of the UN system. This is pretty dangerous. Now, to come to your UK point, why is this a moment of opportunity on the UK-EU relationship? Well, blindingly obvious, really. We're now finding ourselves in a much colder universe than we thought we were going to be on both sides. And if at this point you can't turn that to some advantage, starting next week, and demonstrating that actually on the vast bulk of values questions and economic questions and security questions, we're basically in the same place and basically have the same interests, then I think you're making a big strategic mistake. I'm a little bit less optimistic than your account on that. I mean, I think things are moving. I think it's good that they're moving. I think the mood is better. I think the cooperation over Ukraine in particular has helped the mood. I think we can't underestimate, though, on the UK-EU relationship, there's still a hell of a lot of scar tissue on both sides of the channel, I would say. That's inevitable, and João makes the point very well. I mean, we had several years of extremely unpleasant, corrosive relations, and that affects systems and bureaucrats and mandarins and system thinking, not just politicians. Even when the politicians change and the government change, you're seeing a much thinner relationship between the UK and the EU, even now, even though it's improved in the last few months, that used to exist, and much less mutual understanding of each other's kind of interests. So I think there's a great deal that you could build. I think May the 19th is a start, not a conclusion. I don't think you're going to get very far on May the 19th. I mean, you do some useful things on a defence and security pact, but let's be candid, there isn't a lot in it. It might then lead to something where there is a lot in it, but it isn't a lot in it yet. There's an SPS agreement. Fine, I'm not against an SPS agreement, and it will certainly help with cross-channel trade in certain things, but it's not the biggest thing. It won't impact UK growth or EU growth at all. It's certainly worth doing if you can pull it off. And there may be, you know, closer energy cooperation with, again, on ETS and CBAM and things like that, which is eminently sensible. But I don't think these are first order transformative changes in the UK-EU relationship. Could you get to a point where trust rebuilds, people think we're essentially on the same side, there's a great deal to be done on defense and security, we maybe could do something much more fundamental over the next few years than has so far been conceived of. We share the same security concerns, and actually the UK has to be in a European tent, and the European Union needs the UK in that tent. So you have to work through, you know, joint procurement and common industrial base and all those. I mean, I hope that's true, and I think it ought in many ways to be true, given the scale of the security threat we face from Russia. I just think we're a long way off that yet. I think that's going to be the work of the next several months or couple of years before you, and we haven't got much time, it's going to be the work of the next few months to see whether you can make a much more fundamental breakthrough in relations.
Thank you very much for that assessment. I have an impossible role. I want to give Elena the chance also to respond. And I wanted to ask you also, returning to something that Pierre Vimont said about the sentiment in member states amongst electorates, feeling if the world was just going to be a bit nicer again, if there was peace, you know, why would we have to invest in all of this? Is that something you feel in the work that you do, advising people who are actually members of a parliament that, you know, is feeling the temperature of electorates? So that perspective, I think, would be a real interesting one here. And then I also promised to turn to all of our guests, and there might be some who would like to ask a question or give a comment, and I promise we will do this afterwards. And in the room we have already Elisabetta, who could start moving to the room. Don't put the microphone yet, but be alert because we're going to be fast on this one. Elena.
Thank you. I'll also try to be fast because a lot of the things I'm thinking have already obviously been mentioned, and I'm glad to hear the other speakers, because my sense as well is that Trump is slowly coming towards, I don't know what kind of landing, but definitely a sense of him reaching certain realizations that, by the way, had been reached before by others. And it's just a shame that we're losing so much time by reinventing the wheel and having to spend so much time for him to realize, and others, that, you know, democracies work together better. You can trust other democracies more than you can trust authoritarian regimes. I think with the UK, we have a similar situation in the sense that, you know, 19th of May, I hope, will be a symbolic date in which it manifests something we already learned over 50 years ago, that, you know, geopolitics and geography would have it that UK and Europe and continental Europe would work together on security and defense, for example, because we're surrounded by pretty much the same kind of threat. So what I think is really a shame is that we're losing a lot of time by coming to the same realizations that have been around for decades. Competitiveness is another one. It's become a buzzword now, but it was always the case that, you know, effective soft power had to be backed by competitiveness at home, by solid democracy at home, by prosperity at home, by robust social policies at home. And we are realizing again things that we already knew and losing, I think, time in that process globally, by the way, towards that peace that could be a new type of peace. In the book, it's called cold peace, but it is a new type of peace. And it's really a shame. And here I want to say, I think, one element and variable of that is, unfortunately, technology and the infosphere, which have sort of allowed narratives that challenge those truths that we already know to polarize electorates and to lead to types of policies being legitimized that challenge those established fact-based, scientifically backed truths that we know about policy. So we're again losing time, and it's a shame, but it's a transition moment, and I suppose history has it that this has to happen. Another thing that has been mentioned, and I think is really important in the transatlantic discussion, is my sense is, and this is my opinion, of course, the United States is going through a political reshuffling and a political crisis on so many levels, and a lot of what we're seeing is a manifestation of this kind of pressure cooker that wants to explode about United States politics, that sort of manifests itself, including in foreign policy. And I explain this because of the following. I think the two-party system is facing severe challenges. I don't know if it's widely known, but I read how many Democrats have left the Democratic Party at the moment, hoping that there will be a third-way candidate they can support somehow. But of course, the campaign financing, the way the system is structured, is really blocking this really natural tendency of something that needs to happen from happening. And I think we're seeing a lot of the politics as a result of that. And in some ways, we can say we're fortunate in Europe, because after the financial crisis, some of that normalization or reshuffling of politics happened. In some countries, it was very difficult. I'm Greek, I don't need to say more, but it does happen in a way that allows for various tendencies to sort of find their place and for pressures to inevitably find their place. But the United States, we have that political element of political parties. There is a great, I wouldn't call it clash of civilizations, but reshuffling of the federal versus state level competence. And you see that manifesting itself quite a bit. And then there is a whole discussion about whether the division of powers, executive, judiciary, and legislative, will hold as it is. And this is something, you know, holy in the United States from its creation. But all of this makes it a country which we cannot predict. It depends how this will go. So, and that, you know, the domestic merging with the external, with the foreign policy, means that we know a lot about the United States, but we don't know when it will normalize. So we need to be prepared for some time that it may go in various ways that we do not know. And that goes to the point about having a certain degree of, I don't say separating, but having capacity to be resilient, in terms of the trade part, the economic part, and the defense part. And I think that's the direction that we're seeing things go to. Having said that, it is a natural partner, and this is obviously the point the panel has made. And the final point in reaction to all this, I keep making this point that we know things and we're ignoring them, and this goes to the foresight point that Pierre Vimont made. And I get very worried because there's another thing we've always known, and it comes up and then it stops coming up. And this is that global demographics matter very much. India matters, Africa matters, South America matters. And we talk about it, it comes in and out, this global South conversation. It's something we've known. If you look at development policy in the 1970s, it was already known how connected these areas were with the future of Europe, the future of the United States. It's come back. I think we missed a moment in the 2000s for legitimate reasons. They were claiming their place in global governance, but Europe and the West went into this financial crisis, also described in the book with this meeting of the G20, where really it had to focus on its own introversion problems. But that is going to come back again. And so I think it's important to put it in this room as well, that we should not forget that point, and that it matters for the divorce of nations, because that is the great divorce. The divorce where you will have potentially, 4 billion people saying, we think the West is not catering for the future of our children, our climate, our seas. And that will be a great divorce if it happens, and it can be prevented, which goes back to multilateralism, the reform of the UN, and other such things. How this is manifested in the European Parliament where I work, in the electorates, I think it's a daily thing. I think what we can say is that we see electorates experimenting with different versions of political proposals in the hope that they will get, they all want to get to the same point, is my sense: prosperity, peace, a good life. But they're experimenting with different types of political orientations because, as is also said in the book, there is a sense that something has failed them. And I think this is the issue at hand. But of course, I come back to my initial point and I finish here. This is also a matter of communication. It's a matter of social media and the way people get their information. But it is also a matter of competitiveness, because a competitiveness EU with greater growth can invest in catering for all the needs of the electorates. And we see the public opinion polls: security is high, social policy is high, health is high, cohesion is high. So competitiveness, simplification, I think the direction of doing things faster, better, and in a more prosperous way is really catering to every citizen's need. I'm here in front of my former very big boss, so I'm afraid to speak in any way that is not diplomatic. So I hope I haven't said anything out of line.
Thank you very much also for widening the lens, and Klaus Welle will have the floor in a minute. But first we have our guest in the back. Please kindly introduce yourself briefly. Eli, just turn. The gentleman in the very back. Yes. And please just kindly introduce yourself, and then we're bringing the microphone here to the first row. Please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Maciek Jastrzębiec. I work also in the European Parliament in External Policies Directorate. My question is actually, I didn't read the book yet, but my question is a bit the Portuguese success. So I'm just thinking about, Antonio Vitorino, Gutierrez, Barroso, Costa. This is a generation of people born end of 40s, beginning of 50s. And could you a bit maybe enlighten us why you think there is such a tremendous Portuguese success in the global politics?
Thank you very much. The Portuguese success story. If you allow, Ambassador, one more question/comment. If anybody else would like to come in, here is your opportunity. And then we bring it back. Klaus Welle is coming next.
Thank you very much, Elena. You don't have to worry, because I will be less diplomatic than you. And I will also be more skeptical than most there. Because I think what we see structurally is a fusion of the power of money, technology, media, and politics in the United States, embodied in the person of Elon Musk, but not only. And they have already placed their candidate as we traditionally say, one heartbeat away from the presidency with Mr. Vance, who's had his whole career organized by that group of people. We cannot overlook that they are not ashamed to systematically link into the extreme right in Europe. And when I say extreme right, for example, AfD in Germany, Mr. Vance had no problem to meet the leader of the AfD during the election campaign and recommend that Germans should not vote for Friedrich Merz, but should vote for the AfD. And Elon Musk has been campaigning for them at their party Congress. So this is something else than we have seen in the past. We heard very clearly from Vice President Vance in Munich that now the conventional defense of Europe is up to the Europeans. Hegseth, in his interim instructions for the military, has said, prioritize Asia, assume risk in Europe. Assume risk in Europe, that's us. By the way, the same as Elbridge Colby, the new Undersecretary for Policy, has been arguing for a couple of years. So conventional defense up for the Europeans. How much time do we need to get ready? What about the strategic enablers, which were always dominated by the Americans? If we don't start to build them up now, we will not be there when it matters. And yes, we are relieved that now Russia and Ukraine are kind of treated equally. But honestly, you cannot treat Russia and Ukraine equally. And what does it mean for NATO, which is basically the promise for Europeans to be defended against Russia, if Russia and Ukraine are treated equally? So I'm not in favor of strategic autonomy, but I think strategic sovereignty for Europe now is an absolute must.
Thank you very much, and I'll snatch the microphone to bring it back to the podium. And yes, we will bring it back now to the podium as well, and have first this great question about what is the recipe of success for the Portuguese in Europe. I say I'm very much at ease, and I said it before about this role. And then we have also the opportunity for the panelists to respond to Klaus Welle, of course, before you get the final.
Thank you. The magic formula is in the book, so you have to buy the book. Now, sorry, I became a sort of a salesman. No, more seriously, I'm also impressed, I must say. You know, I was working in Brussels and suddenly came a Portuguese president of the European Commission, which chose me as chief of staff. So that was a surprise. I go to New York and suddenly the UN elects the Portuguese Secretary General, and I had to work with great pleasure, work with him hand in hand, and that was also a thing. I was about to join the Catholic Church in hope of having a Portuguese It didn't work, so
the key is to have you somewhere nearby.
I retreated from that. So as you see, we are not that successful yet because the Vatican is still not there, but we're working on it. We have a very good cardinal rising up the right. Now, I think, and I must this question a few. I've been asked this question a few times, and I think this plays into the benefits or the margin of maneuver of mid-sized small countries in multilateral environments, and particularly the one we know best, the European Union. And if a country or the people sort of representing the country act skillfully enough, intelligently enough, they can get to positions of interest. And I think I must say patriotically that my country did quite well. I mean, if you look at the situation, but you can think of other countries. Luxembourg is maybe the best example. I worked for, I don't know how many presidencies and bosses, and so it's quite relevant. Belgium the same. So I think it's part of that. It's also a country that has been exposed to the world. You know, we speak foreign language relatively well, and we kind of have no big issues with anyone. We talk to everyone. We engage with everyone. We are now campaigning for the Security Council again, so I'm part of that. If any of you vote, you know what to do. Actually, by the way, against other European countries, which is a subject in my book as well, how the EU operates inside the UN, and we have a couple of interesting stories there. So, you know, but all this does not replace the magic formula that you'll find in page 179, if I'm not wrong. Now, on the issues that Klaus and others raised, sorry, the issue that has been raised, and let me be clear about one point. As much as I don't want to give up on the US too soon, I don't want certainly not to give up on the EU too soon. And I think we cannot afford to lose this opportunity. And we should not be complacent. And I know there are people that tend to be complacent because, again, we are all a little bit lazy. But this is a moment in which we cannot miss, an opportunity we cannot miss. This is the one where we need to be stronger at home. Everything that's been said about competitiveness, technology, defense and security, and all this, and I treat it in a book in what I call Bermuda triangles. They use Bermuda triangles where you have to calibrate different elements, and these are absolutely crucial. But you also need to be strong abroad, and this is about us being less arrogant and less naive on the external front, about us being more flexible in our alliances. We don't need to wait to agree with a country on every single issue to be able to make a constructive alliance with them. And we now see all this coalition of the willings, the US to do more of that. And if we don't agree totally on human rights with the country, but we absolutely agree on trade, you know, let's be more realistic and realist in terms of foreign policy than we have been. But at the same time, we need to work with the South. And I think the way we talk to this, I don't like the expression global South. I never use it. I don't think it is in the book. But I'm talking about the countries that are developing countries. They're being abandoned by the US. They're being courted by China. Where are we on that? And there are people here with the responsibility in those areas. I know they're doing their best, but this is an opportunity for us and an obligation, a duty for us to engage differently with countries in the South. I'm working with Dora over there in ODI Europe, a new think tank that I chair here. And our purpose is to have a different kind of dialogue with these countries. And I think the opportunity is there. The gap is there. I mean, these countries are turning to China if we don't act quickly and effectively enough. And I think this is a major area. So I do support, I'm not in favor of strategic autonomy in the sense, I'm in favor of strategic strengthening of the EU. And I think this is the way forward. But I agree with Pierre. I mean, it's very easy for our systems the default is to do nothing. The default is to pray and wait for things to become better. Even if we get signs from the US that it will not be as bad as may be expected, we should not relax on our side. And I think this is a message it comes, I guess, clearly from the book.
Can I just, and this would be sort of the wrapping up here with our guests as well, follow exactly on what you just did. What does it take to navigate this world successfully? And I'm doing that as well because not only are there younger colleagues here, and I include myself as one of those in our own vantage points that must have the ambition to take things forward, but we're also recording this and using it in our various contexts. So I think it would be very good to hear from each and every one following the good example of João. What does it take? What do we need in our baskets beyond the things that you described to be able to navigate this world together, not to end with a divorce of nations and divorces within nations and all sorts of other divorces we can imagine? What does it take? Just in a very quick wrapping up. And of course, I mean, I don't want to prevent you from making also comments about the things that have been said, but let's try that first.
Well, to Klaus's point, I think he's right, and there's a divide on values which is more substantial than any we've seen in decades. Of course, there are elements of considerable continuity in American preoccupations and American policy and isolationism and exceptionism. We've never had an American president and an American system so flagrantly essentially taking sides in European politics in order to influence European politics. I mean, you mentioned the J.D. Vance speech at Munich. That's pretty remarkable. And the decision essentially to intervene the week before a German federal election in the way they chose to do, obviously very deliberate choice. And it's not the only example. So there is element, we may be seeing a softening of it. We may be seeing elements of a rapprochement or sobering up on the American side, whatever, but I wouldn't overstate it. I do think there's a values chasm across the Atlantic, which is bigger than it was before. And I think we see any number of manifestations of that on policy, but also on values of a kind of what is the West? What does it stand for? And as Klaus says, you can't really, you can't treat Russia and Ukraine equally. They're not equal. And we have every reason really to believe from US behavior at the moment that they want a degree of normalization with Russia. I hope, that there is some sobering up going on and there are one or two preliminary signs of it, but actively want that and see that as an American national interest, and that could lead to a world where there's a sharper divide between the US and the EU, and indeed the UK, on normalization with Russia, lifting of sanctions, and a deliberate attempt by the Americans to divide and rule the EU by getting individual member states to thwart the continuation of sanctions, which is going to cause complexity, obviously, for the Commission and others if that's not where we want to be. So I remain pretty worried. In terms of what we need to do, I think we do need to be serious, and I think the jury is still out on whether we, and I mean that we, UK and EU, are serious. I mean, some good signs, but some equivocal signs, as Pierre rightly said. If we're going to be serious, and Klaus is right to raise the strategic enablers point, and the extent to which for decades we've been too complacent, Americans have more than a point on that, too reliant on kind of American spending and technological leadership. And we're now in a situation where we're simply not able to act with hard power in the world in the way that we would wish to. That is at least a decade-long process if we're going to get it right. And what's our problem on that? You can't do all of that through NATO, for very obvious reasons, because you don't know kind of how NATO will work and whether it will work, and the American role. You're already seeing a very different dynamic in discussions around Ukraine, but this is not just Ukraine, this is the much wider strategic capability issue, and where does Europe collectively, including the UK, want to be? We don't have the institutions either in NATO or the EU or the fora in which to progress what I think is an extremely complex agenda. So I think it's encouraging that leaders are doing what they're doing in the way that they're doing it on Ukraine. But this is a much bigger and more strategic and long-term problem than Ukraine. And we don't actually have the fora, the institutions, whatever. My worry on this is there's a lot of, I don't want to be unkind, slightly blithe thinking that a lot of this can be driven intergovernmentally, coalitions of the willing, etc. Fine. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can't do everything intergovernmentally and simply through leaders' processes. And this is not a blah, blah declaratory process. This is going to have to be a set of processes with defense implications, financial implications, commercial implications, private sector implications, where governments individually and collectively are going to have to work differently with the private sector from anything they've been used to in the last 50 or 60 years. And we don't know how to do this. What does it need? It needs serious people in capitals, including this one, to be working together on what do we need without bogging ourselves down in ridiculous institutional machinery. How do we get on with it? And what is the it that we're trying to get on with? So it does need a whole bunch of intelligent people around European capitals, and I include London in those European capitals, working through what set of problems are we really trying to address and over what timescale in order to be able to deliver what in a very uncertain global environment where we don't know how permanent this change with the US is. So I think There's a great deal that could and should be done. I think we have a lot of the capability, but not all of it to get it done. I think it's partly private sector in terms of European companies, including UK companies, but those companies will only act if they're given the incentives to act. And of course, the purchasing authorities are their governments. So and we now have much more money flowing into defence than we have ever had in the last 30 years. I mean, this is not a great thing in life, really, to be celebrating rearmament spending, but that's sadly where we are. So there's a great deal more money flowing into this, but we don't yet have any of the institutional fora and processes with which to deal with the problem.
You see why this is an impossible job here. I want to immediately dive into about 10 of the things you said and ask each and every one of you and get further advice from all of you how we're going to go about that, but we cannot. And I want to give Pierre Vimont the chance to respond and Elena for a final one, and then we will invite you over for the next stage of this evening. Pierre Vimont.
I'll try to be quick and ask straightforwardly your question. How does the European Union make a difference in the geopolitics today? I think the first thing is to understand where we're sitting, the geopolitical environment at the moment. Rightly so, several of you underlined the fact that there was a lot of European arrogance to some extent. Let me just give you two examples, which I find quite striking, coming from southern countries. The first one, we were discussing about the UN. You all know that because of the rotating system, but at the moment in the UN Security Council, 15 members, 1/3 of those members are Europeans, 5 out of 15. You know, whatever we may say, it's not our fault, that's the way the system works. When you are coming from India, Brazil, South Africa, whatever, Japan, Germany, of course, but I'm only thinking about our partners from the South, they tend to think that this is a little bit of European arrogance anyway. Secondly, Gaza, whatever the responsibility of everyone, for the last year or so, the humanitarian situation in Gaza has been, we all know, dreadful. And Europe has been totally powerless, hence the criticism of double standards, so on and so forth. And we think this is very unfair, and maybe it is, but the reality is there. And we have to be aware of that reality. Today, and this has happened to me quite recently again, when we're discussing with our Middle East partners, and we explain to them all the intricacies of the Ukrainian conflict, they just laugh at us and tell us, what have you done with regard to Gaza? So my point is, if you want to be a geopolitical player, you have to understand the environment in which you are operating. And at the moment, that environment is not all that good for Europe. And we have to be aware of that. And we have to some extent to change our attitude. And then the second point is straightforward, and I even want to be a little bit provocative if I can at the end. If we want to be a geopolitical actor, it requires a completely change of our mindset at the moment. We have been discussing time and again about how to help Ukraine in its confrontation with Russia. And much of what we have done was great. And I still believe that what we did since February 2022 was right: financial assistance, humanitarian assistance, military assistance, etc. The fact is, and let's be all honest and candid about this, is that if the playground has changed recently, and if at last we have started to discuss about a ceasefire or something like that, it's not due to the EU leaders, and even the 5 of them who went to Kiev during the last weekend. It's due to the Americans. It's due to Trump and Steve Witkoff. They are the ones who have put this issue on the table time and again in the last month or so, which means if we want to be a player in that hardball game today of geopolitics, We need to be a little bit more innovative, a little bit more action-oriented. We need to think out of the box a little bit more than just thinking about having a statement at 27 on every monthly foreign affairs or 25 or 26 because of Hungary. That's not the point. The point is coming out with a great idea and pushing it forward. As, let's be honest, we could be able to do it a few years ago. And João, in his book, reminds us about the role that high representatives like Javier Solana, even Cathy Ashton on the Balkans on the Iranian nuclear issue.
And working with the US. Great lines in the book as well, yeah.
There is even a photo with Obama, João and Obama sitting side by side. You know, this is what is desperately needed, because what we hear from all our partners outside of Europe is that this is a real opportunity for Europe. Why are you not there? That's the question we're being asked time and again. And my answer is a different mindset, honestly, at the end of the day. A way of looking at the geopolitical reality in a completely different way and being able to act at the end of the day. And I think that is really what is required today. Last point, and I will be very quick on European defense. And there has, you know, on European defense at the moment, with regard to NATO and American security, we're facing three options. It's the breakdown, right? Breakdown, we can't agree with America and America leaves. I don't think we will see it because I think they're not there. The second one is a peaceful transfer, what I will call, what is called at the moment a lot in Washington, D.C., the burden shifting. NATO, Europe owns NATO at the end of the day. Let's hope it takes, you know, a meaningful, slow process, but we managed to get somewhere there. And there is the in-between. And this is where I think we could be heading and where the danger may lie, which is a gray area where we have neither a breakdown, nor a peaceful transfer, but something that would look, and this is typically Trumpian, I would say, a very chaotic, disorderly, unhinged division of labor between the US and the EU. And this is where I think the danger lies, and where the Europeans have to be very open, wide open-eyed, wide-eyed open, because this is where the devil will be in the details. And I think this is where, here again, Europe needs to have a real geopolitical mind to handle and tackle this new European security as it may be foreseen.
Thank you very much, Per. Elena, what does it take? What's your what do you add to the recipe of success?
It's difficult to add to this. I mean, you asked what should we do to avoid the divorce of nations, and my first reaction is therapy. And then I thought maybe this is the next book, The Therapy of Nations. But no, but in all seriousness, I mean, a lot has been said. I think what we need is balance and balancing acts. And in many ways, I think it's been said before. I think what the late Joe Nye called smart power was about balance. I think what Federica Mogherini in the global strategy called principal pragmatism was about a balancing act. The balancing act is realizing that we are in a time that at each time the balance between what we call soft power and what we call hard power, the material and the values, the interests and the values, at each moment in geopolitics, you need to have the right combination in order to project power. This is a moment where material seems to be mattering a lot. Materials, raw materials, industrial products, economy, competitiveness. So this seems to be the geopolitical moment where this is extremely important in order to be able to do the other, to project, to have a Brussels effect. And at each moment, you also need to think about the constraints in managing this balancing act. Strategic enablers have been mentioned. I mean, some of them Europe can produce in 3, 4, 5 years, satellite-based ones mostly. And they're interesting because they're also dual use. They can help also with crisis management, with climate change, with meteorological observation. Some of them, Europe will need a lot of time to produce, so strategic airlift. So you need to see what makes sense in order to have this sort of balancing act of power projection, but also efficiency. And same with regulation. Regulation is really important. It also ensures anti-corruption, at the same time, competitiveness and regulation. It's another big balancing act. Supply chains are a balancing act. How much do you reshore? How much do you remind? But how much do you also import, and not just for the sake of it being cheaper, but of creating alliances? You need to lock in those alliances. So everything is a balancing act. And I think this is really the big bet. And many have tried to say it in different ways. So for me, this is the answer. If I may make a final point on Portugal, because to finish on a lighter note, in Greece, we say Greeks cannot praise Greece, but foreigners can. So I'm not Portuguese. But what I can say about Portugal, having lived in Brazil for a very long time, and Portugal now feeling like home, I always had this thing in Brazil. I always thought, because people heard I had a weird Portuguese accent, so they thought I was from Portugal. This is what they think in Brazil.
Adopted.
So I always thought, Portugal is almost the size of my country, but it's really a big country. And I think this is the secret. It's a big, small country. So it has, this legado, this legacy of being an empire. It has this interesting way of being multilateral also in Africa. And it has the modesty and the understanding of others that a small country has. So I finish here so that we can say something positive in the end and not the doom and gloom of the global environment.
So where we take this certainly this evening, and Ambassador, dear João, you brought us together here. I'm very grateful for that, because we have a conversation that I could not possibly lead in a way that would have been appropriate, because we would have needed a lot more time, and I know we already went beyond time. What I would like to say is a profound thank you to all our guests here on the podium, Ambassadors, Elena, Lazaro, Commissioner, Excellencies, distinguished guests, friends and colleagues. For me, it was an honor and an absolutely delightful way of spending this evening. It is not over yet. We are inviting you, and of course, João, who brought us here together, has the final word, but I will say a few housekeeping information. We have the possibility to get into a conversation and to refreshments in the adjacent room. There you can also have the book, which Ambassador Vale de Almeida also agreed to sign if you're interested. And João, you will leave us into this evening with a final conclusion.
Thank you very much, Helmut. Thank you all for is this working? Not working. Maybe I can project my voice still.
Let's try this one.
Sorry. Thank you very much for all of you for again spending part of your afternoon here. If I think of a sentence that sort of I think should drive us in the coming weeks, months, or maybe years, is from Hamlet. Very cultivated man, and it's about madness and method. If you look at two major capitals in the world today and two great leaders, I think I would try to find method in the madness, other side of the Atlantic, and madness in the method on the continental neighbor. Maybe it's a good driving principle for us to continue our discussion. If this book as a purpose is to open discussions like this with people that have experience, some more than others, with young people that are about to gain experience, and to share what we have experienced and try to move forward. And I hope this can be helpful. And I hope you read it and hope you enjoyed it. And if you have criticism, turn it back to me one way or the other, because it will be part of my process, creative process of understanding how people react to some of the things I've written. Thank you very much. And please enjoy the cocktail, and I'll be seeing you next door. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.